thought it would be a pleasant surprise. It had been 2 weeks since my wife Claire had moved into her father's house in Crestline to take care of him. Old Mr. Abram had taken a fall, fractured his hip, and she, being the devoted daughter she always was, didn't hesitate to go. We talked on the phone every night, but I missed her presence, her warmth in our bed, the sound of her humming as she folded laundry on the back porch. Our 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, missed her too, asking every night, "When is Mommy coming home?" So on a sunny Saturday in July, I decided we would make the 1-hour drive to her father's country house. A surprise visit, just the three of us, reunited, even if only for a day. I didn't tell her we were coming. I figured the smile on her face when she opened the door and saw us would be worth the trip. Sophie was excited, bouncing in the back seat the whole way. We brought flowers, a cornbread from Miller's Bakery, and Sophie had drawn a colorful picture of the 4 of us holding hands. The road wound through hills and forests until finally I heard the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires of our '98 Forester. Everything seemed normal. The old Ford F-150 in the driveway, the wind chimes tinkling in the mountain breeze, but something felt off. As I lifted Sophie out of her car seat, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. Not wide, open, just enough to raise questions. I paused, holding Sophie's small hand in mine. She was strangely quiet, her eyes fixed on the gap in the door. I tried to ignore the feeling. Maybe they just hadn't closed it properly. Maybe they were expecting a delivery or had stepped out for some fresh air. "Daddy, there's a huge beetle. Over there." Sophie pointed to the doorframe, trying to distract me. But I knew this house. I had helped Mr. Abram renovate the porch last year after the spring rains damaged the roof. It was a simple but cozy place, a mix of rustic influences Mr. Abram brought when he moved from Appalachia 20 years ago. The smell of coffee always hung in the air, mixed with the scent of the rose bushes Claire had planted to brighten up the garden. "Let's go inside, Princess. Maybe Grandma made that lemon cake you love," I said, trying to sound cheerful though. The ajar door still bothered me. Sophie hesitated for a moment as if she sensed something too, but soon her childish excitement overcame any apprehension. "Is Grandpa feeling better? I brought my toy stethoscope for him to see," she said, pointing to the Hello Kitty backpack she wore. Her innocence calmed me a little. Children have that power, don't they? To bring us back to the present moment when our minds start wandering down dark paths. I balanced the cake in one hand and the flowers in the other. The day was beautiful, the kind of day that makes you believe nothing bad can happen. A deep blue cloudless sky, and the sun shining without the suffocating heat typical of a summer day. It was almost too perfect. Maybe that's why the contrast with what we were about to find was so disturbing. "Hello? Claire? Mr. Abram?" I called as I approached the door. No answer. Just the wind in the trees and the distant song of a robin. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door. Why hadn't they answered? Claire would always answer, would always come running if she knew Sophie was here. She missed her daughter as much as Sophie missed her. Every night on our video call, I could see her eyes well up with tears when Sophie showed her a new drawing, or told her about her day at school. I gave the door a gentle push with my elbow, trying to balance the cake and flowers. The door creaked, softly, revealing the living room. Sunlight streamed through the lace-curtained windows, illuminating dust motes suspended in the air. Everything looked normal at first glance. The same old furniture, the grandfather clock Mr. Abram inherited from his grandfather, the photographs on the wall. But there was something different, something in the air, a heavy, almost palpable silence. "Let's go in, Sophie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's make it a real surprise." Sophie squeezed my hand tighter, as if she had suddenly lost her earlier excitement. Children are sensitive to these things, aren't they? They feel what adults try to ignore. I placed the cake and flowers on the coffee table and called out again, "Claire? We're here! Surprise!" The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Then Sophie let go of my hand and took a few steps toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. She stopped abruptly, as if she'd seen something. My heart raced. What had she seen that I couldn't see from here? "Sophie, wait," I called, but she remained still, staring into the dark hallway. That's when I noticed a dining chair was overturned, as if someone had stood up in a hurry. And the framed photo of our wedding, which normally sat on the sideboard, was lying face down. The glass cracked. My stomach sank. Something was very wrong. "Dad, look, but be quiet." Sophie gently pulled on my shirt sleeve, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad," she said, her eyes wide and alert. "Look, but be quiet." She had peeked into the hallway. I knelt beside her, placing my hand on her shoulder to stop her from going any further. I followed her gaze, crouching down to see what had caught her attention. The air inside the house felt still, too still. No radio playing those old country tunes Mr. Abram loved so much. No footsteps, just a heavy, motionless silence. That's when I noticed. The light in the guest room was on, but no one was in sight. A chair was knocked over near the hallway, and the framed portrait of our wedding that normally sat on the side table was lying face down on the sisal rug. My heart began to pound. Instinctively, I reached for my cell phone, but then I stopped. If something had happened and if someone dangerous was still inside? I looked at Sophie, her face full of innocent concern. I couldn't just walk in. I also couldn't leave without knowing. I whispered for her to stay behind me no matter what, and silently pushed the door open a few more inches. "Grandpa's sleeping," Sophie murmured, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. But he talked to me. A shiver ran down my spine. "What do... You mean he talked to you?" I looked at the little girl, her brown eyes steady and calm, too calm for the situation. "Sophie, how do you know Grandpa is sleeping? Did you see him?" She shook her head. "No, he spoke here," she pointed to her own head. "Like when we play guessing games." I swallowed hard. Sophie always had this sensitivity that neither Claire nor I could explain. Since she was very young, she knew things she shouldn't know, predicted small everyday events. Once, she woke up in the middle of the night insisting we had to call my mother because she had fallen. We called, more to calm her down than because we believed her, and found out my mother had indeed fallen down the stairs and was trying to reach the phone. "What else did he say, Sophie?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "That Mommy is sad. That we need to be quiet because she's talking to him." A lump formed in my throat. Sophie's words could mean many things, none of them comforting. Mr. Abram was sick, yes, but when we spoke to Claire the night before, she had said he was improving, that he could already sit up on his own and had even eaten some chicken broth. I stood up slowly, holding Sophie's hand tightly. The wooden floor creaked slightly under my feet and I froze for a moment. If there was an intruder in the house, I had just announced our presence. But the silence continued, absolute and oppressive. "Let's go find Mommy," I whispered to Sophie. "But if I tell you to run, you run to the car, get in, lock the doors, and duck down, understand?" She nodded solemnly, her eyes fixed on mine. There was a maturity in that look, something that shouldn't be there in a 6-year-old. We moved down the hallway, the dim light coming through the gaps in the curtains creating elongated shadows on the exposed brick walls. This house, which had always seemed so welcoming, now had a sinister air, as if the walls themselves held a secret they didn't want to reveal. The guest room was empty, the bed made as if no one had slept there. The small desk under the window had papers scattered on it, medical prescriptions from what I could see at a glance, and some notes in Claire's neat handwriting. The bathroom door was ajar, but no one was there either. Just a wet towel thrown on the floor and a fogged-up mirror, as if someone had recently showered. Only the master bedroom at the end of the hall remained. The door was closed, an unusual fact in the routine of a house where doors were rarely closed except at night. The light was on. I could see the golden beam escaping from under the door. I made a move to knock, but Sophie stopped me, placing a small finger on her lips. "Quiet," she whispered again. "Grandpa said." My hand trembled slightly as I touched the doorknob. I turned it slowly, feeling every movement of the internal mechanism, each metallic click sounding like thunder in the silence of the house. The door opened without a sound, revealing the room illuminated by the soft light of the lamp, and there was Claire, sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to the door. Her shoulders moved in a subtle rhythm, as if she were talking in a low voice. On the bed, under the patchwork quilt that Mr. Abrams' mother, Mrs. Eleanor, had made decades ago, lay a still form. From where I stood, I could only see the outline of a body and a wrinkled, pale hand resting on the colorful quilt. Sophie let go of my hand and took a step forward before I could stop her. My heart raced. I wanted to pull her back, to protect her from whatever was happening in that room. "Sophie, don't," I started, but she had already entered the room, walking with small, determined steps toward her mother. Claire didn't turn around, as if she already knew we were there, as if she had been waiting for us all along. "Mommy," Sophie called softly, her clear voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Has Grandpa gone?" It was then that Claire finally turned. Her face was pale, her eyes red but dry, as if she had cried for hours and now had no tears left. She looked at Sophie with an expression that mixed surprise and resignation, as if the girl's question confirmed something she already suspected. "How do you know, my love?" Claire asked, her voice hoarse. "He told me," Sophie answered simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He said you were talking to him, that you needed a little time." Claire looked at me then, for the first time since we entered the room. Her eyes were empty, distant, as if a part of her had left with her father. "Michael," she said my name like a prayer. "How did you know to come?" "We wanted to surprise you," I answered, taking a few hesitant steps into the room. I could now see clearly what was on the bed. Mr. Abram was lying on his back, eyes closed, hands crossed over his chest. His face had a serenity I never saw in his life. He was dead, no doubt, but there was a peace about him that contrasted with the horror of the situation. "He passed this morning," Claire said, looking back at her father. "I woke up and he was already gone. He didn't suffer. The doctor said it was his heart." Sophie approached the bed and, to my astonishment, took her grandfather's lifeless hand. "Bye, Grandpa," she said with a naturalness that sent a chill down my spine. "I brought you a drawing. It's here in my backpack. Can I leave it with him, Mommy?" Claire just nodded, watching with an unreadable expression as Sophie opened her backpack, took out a colorful piece of paper and carefully placed it on her grandfather's chest. "So he can take it with him," she explained. Something had happened. That was evident. I entered the room slowly, the wooden floorboards creaking under my feet. My senses were on high alert, ears listening for any sound, eyes scanning every movement. The air had a strange chill, as if the heater had been off for hours despite the warm day outside. Sophie was still holding my hand, but she remained silent, just as I had asked. I approached Claire and sat beside her on the edge of the bed. She was no longer crying. Her eyes were dry but empty, like the windows of an abandoned house. I took her hand in mine and felt the cold in her fingers, a cold that seemed to come from within. "When did it happen?" I asked quietly, looking at Mr. Abrams' serene body. "Around 5 in the morning," Claire answered, her voice a thin thread almost breaking. "I had just given him his pain medication. He seemed better last night. He even ate a little. We talked about the farm, about planting more apple trees in the spring." A pause. "He said he wanted to see Sophie running between the trees when the fruit was ripe." I looked at Sophie, who was now on the other side of the bed, observing her grandfather with a serene curiosity, without fear. It was strange how she seemed to perfectly understand what was happening, accepting the reality of death as just another fact of life. "You didn't call anyone?" I asked gently, without accusation. Claire shook her head. I knew he was gone. There was nothing to do. I stayed here with him, talking, saying goodbye. She finally looked me in the eye. "I think a part of me didn't want to make it real yet," When I call the doctor, the funeral home, it all becomes official. There's no turning back. I understood what she meant. There's a limbo between the moment of death and the moment the outside world becomes aware of it. A sacred space where only those present participate, where time seems suspended. Claire was trying to preserve that moment for as long as possible. And then you showed up, she continued, a faint, ghostly smile passing her lips, as if you knew. I thought about how strange the timing of our visit was, deciding to make a surprise visit today of all days after 2 weeks of not seeing her. Coincidence? Or something more? Something we can't explain with our everyday logic. "Daddy?" Sophie called from the other side of the bed, her clear voice cutting through my thoughts. "Grandpa wants us to call Father Michael. He doesn't want to wait too long." Claire and I exchanged glances. Father Michael was the priest of the church Mr. Abram faithfully attended every Sunday in Crestline. How did Sophie know that? We had never mentioned the priest's name to her. "Sophie, how do you know about Father Michael?" Claire asked, her voice now firmer, as if the mention of the priest had brought some resolution to her initial grief. Sophie shrugged, as children do when they consider the answer obvious. "Grandpa told me. He said the priest will be sad, but that we should invite him for lunch afterward, and that we should make that lasagna he likes." A shiver ran down my spine. That was exactly the kind of thing Mr. Abram would say. Practical to the end, concerned about others' feelings, and always thinking about the next meal. Mr. Abram was known for his love of a well-prepared meal, and Sunday lasagna was a tradition he had maintained for decades. Claire stood up slowly, as if waking from a trance. "I'll call Father Michael," she said, picking up the phone from the bedside table. "And then Dr. Evans. He'll need to certify the death." As Claire left the room to make the calls, I was left alone with Sophie and Mr. Abram's body. The midday light filtered softly through the cracks in the blinds, creating a pattern of golden lines on the bed. There was a stillness in the air, but it was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence we felt upon entering the house. It was a different kind of silence, almost comforting, like the silence of an empty church or a forest at dawn. "You're not scared, Sophie?" I asked quietly, watching my daughter who remained by her grandfather's side, now adjusting the drawing on his chest. She looked up at me, those eyes that always seemed to know more than they should. "No, Dad. Grandpa is just different now. He doesn't hurt anymore." The simplicity with which she expressed this left me speechless. It was true. The suffering Mr. Abram had experienced in recent weeks with the fractured hip and all the subsequent complications had finally ended. Sophie continued, her voice small but steady. "He said he can take care of us in a different way now, that we won't see him but he'll be there, like a guardian angel but Grandpa." I smiled, despite the tears starting to form in my eyes. The image of Mr. Abram as a grumpy guardian angel, with his suspenders and his straw hat, was strangely comforting. Claire returned to the room a few minutes later, her face a little more composed, as if the calls had helped bring some structure to the emotional chaos she was experiencing. "Father Michael is on his way, and so is Dr. Evans." She sat down again on the edge of the bed and touched her father's face gently. "It's time to say goodbye officially, Dad." I sat beside her and put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned against me, her body seeming to finally give in to exhaustion and sadness. Sophie joined us, squeezing between us, forming a small circle of human warmth in contrast to the coldness of death. "He knew," Claire murmured against my shoulder. "Last night, when I said goodnight to him, he held my hand tighter than he had in the last few days. He looked at me differently and said, 'Sleep well, my flowers. Tomorrow is another day.' That wasn't what he usually said. Normally he'd say, 'See you tomorrow,' or 'See you in the morning.' I think he knew." "Grandpa always knows things," Sophie commented matter-of-factly, like he knew we were coming today. Claire looked at her daughter with an expression of surprise and recognition. "Is that right, Sophie? Did he tell you that?" Sophie nodded. "He said the surprise was his for us, that he waited for us to get here before he went." Claire covered her mouth with her hand, tears finally welling up in her eyes. They were the first tears she had shed since our arrival, as if Sophie's words had broken a dam inside her. "My father," she sobbed, holding Mr. Abrams' lifeless hand. "You were always so stubborn, weren't you? Had to do everything your way, right up to the last moment." I remained silent, holding my wife as she cried, finally allowing herself to fully feel the loss. Sophie stayed between us, a small but strong presence like a bridge between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond it. Outside, we heard the sound of a car approaching, tires crunching on the gravel driveway. Probably Father Michael, arriving for the final rituals that would mark Mr. Abrams' passing from this world. "I think we should get ready," I said softly to Claire. "Do you want me to greet the priest while you stay with your father a little longer?" She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hands. "Please, and maybe you could make some coffee? Dad always insisted you should never receive visitors without offering coffee." I smiled, recalling how strict Mr. Abram was with his rules of hospitality. "I'll make the strongest coffee he liked, the kind that, according to him, could make a dead man sit up in bed." A small smile appeared on Claire's face, despite her tears. He would love the irony of that right now. Stood up and kissed Claire on the forehead. Sophie remained by her mother's side, the two now united in their silent farewell. I walked to the bedroom door and paused for a moment, looking back. The scene was etched in my memory. Claire and Sophie sitting on the edge of the bed, the sunlight forming a golden halo around them, and Mr. Abram serene in his eternal sleep, Sophie's colorful drawing on his chest, a final message of love for his final journey. She wasn't afraid, but I was. The doorbell rang, echoing through the silent house. I looked at Claire, who was still holding her father's hand, her eyes now swollen but calmer. Sophie was sitting in the wicker armchair next to the bed, swinging her little legs in the air as if she were patiently waiting for a movie to start at the theater. "That must be Father Michael," I said, lightly squeezing Claire's shoulder before leaving the room. I opened the front door and there he was, a man in his 60s with gray hair and a serene expression on his time-worn face. He was dressed simply in a black shirt with a white collar and dark pants, not the full clericals, but formal enough for the occasion. "You must be Michael," he said, extending his hand. "Mr. Abram spoke a lot about you." "He did?" I asked, surprised. My father-in-law had always been a man of few words, especially when it came to showing affection. "Oh yes, said you were as stubborn as a mule but had a good heart." The priest smiled, softening the formality of the moment. "Where is he?" I led Father Michael down the hallway, feeling a strange sense of unreality. How had I gotten here? A few hours ago I was at home, excited about the idea of surprising my wife, and now I was guiding a priest to my father-in-law's deathbed. When we reached the room, Claire stood up to greet the priest. There was a brief hug between them, murmured words of comfort. Sophie remained seated, watching everything with quiet attention. "Hello, little one," the priest addressed her, kneeling to be at her eye level. "You must be Sophie." Sophie nodded. "You're Father Michael. Grandpa said you were coming." The priest seemed intrigued but not surprised. Perhaps in his profession he had encountered similar situations, children who seemed to know more than they should about the boundaries between life and death. "Your grandfather was a man of great faith," he replied simply. "Are you ready to help us say goodbye to him?" Sophie nodded again, as solemn as a little adult. "Grandpa already explained what's going to happen." Claire and I exchanged glances. There was something in the naturalness with which Sophie spoke that was both comforting and unsettling, as if she were having a normal conversation with someone who was no longer among us. The priest began the rituals, prayers in a low voice, the anointing with holy oils, the words of farewell. I stood near the window, watching the scene, feeling like a spectator in a strange and melancholic dream. The afternoon light now entered orange through the cracks in the blinds, creating dancing patterns on the dark wooden floor. At one point, while the priest was reciting a prayer, Sophie suddenly stood up from the armchair and walked to the foot of the bed. She raised her head as if looking at something or someone hovering above her grandfather's body. "Sophie?" I called softly, concerned about her behavior. She didn't answer, continuing to stare intently at the empty space. The priest paused his prayer, observing the girl with a curious expression. Claire also looked at her daughter, a mixture of concern and fascination on her face. "Okay, Grandpa," Sophie said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I'll tell them." She turned to us, her large, dark eyes seeming even larger in her pale little face. "Grandpa says it's time, that they don't need to wait anymore, that he's okay now." Father Michael showed no surprise, just a slight smile of understanding. Claire sobbed softly, squeezing her father's lifeless hand one last time. "He also said," Sophie continued, now looking directly at Claire, "that Mommy doesn't need to worry about the promise anymore. He understands now." Claire covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes widening in shock. "How do you know that, Sophie?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sophie shrugged, as children do when they find the answer obvious. "Grandpa just told me." "What promise is that?" I asked Claire quietly as the priest returned to his prayers. She wiped away a tear. "I promised him I would never sell the farm, that I would keep it in the family forever, as he always wanted." But she hesitated. "You and I know that financially it would be difficult to keep the place." I didn't know how to tell him, how to break the promise. I nodded, understanding. The farm was Mr. Abram's treasure, the piece of land he had bought, with the sweat of decades of work as a carpenter. It was his legacy, his little paradise. But maintaining the place was expensive, and we, living in the city with our jobs and Sophie's life, could hardly be there often enough to justify the effort. "Sophie," I called, approaching her. "Did Grandpa say anything else?" She thought for a moment, frowning as she did when she was trying to remember the details of a story. "He said the box behind the wardrobe has the answers." Then she added, as if just remembering, "And that the lady in blue will help." I looked at Claire, confused. "Lady in blue?" "Mrs. Gable," she murmured, seeming to understand. "The neighbor. She always wears blue dresses. She was the one who took care of Dad when he had pneumonia last year, before he came to live with us for a while." Father Michael finished his prayers and closed his small book. "It is done," he said softly. "Mr. Abram is now in God's hands." There was a moment of respectful silence. Then Sophie said something that made the room feel even colder. "He's gone now," she announced, looking at the empty space above the bed. "He said, 'See you later,' not goodbye." The priest smiled at her, a mixture of affection and admiration in his gaze. "You know, little one, in all my years as a priest I've met a few children like you. Children who see beyond the veil. It's a precious gift." "Veil?" Sophie asked, curious. "The veil that separates this world from the next," he explained gently. "Most of us adults can't see through it, but some children, and some pure-hearted adults, sometimes can." Sophie seemed to consider this for a moment. "It's not a veil, Father, it's more like a door ajar. You can see a little bit of the other side if you peek through the crack." Father Michael chuckled softly, a surprisingly cheerful sound in that solemn environment. "I think you're right, Sophie. A door ajar describes it much better." Claire stood up, looking stronger now, as if her daughter's and the priest's words had given her some comfort. "I'll make some coffee for us, Father, and we need to call the funeral home." "I'll help you," I offered, wanting to give her practical support in this difficult time. As we prepared to leave the room, Sophie remained by the bed like a little sentinel. "Aren't you coming, honey?" I asked, holding out my hand to her. She shook her head. "I'm going to stay a little longer. I want to say goodbye properly. I exchanged glances with Claire, who nodded slightly. All right, my love. We'll be in the kitchen if you need us. We left Sophie in the room with the priest, who seemed perfectly at ease with the situation. As we walked down the hall, Claire held my arm. Michael, she said quietly, how could Sophie know about the promise? I never talked to her about it. I never mentioned it to anyone but my father. I had no answer for that. I just held Claire, feeling her body tremble slightly against mine. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe some things are beyond our understanding. She nodded against my chest. You know what's strangest? I'm not scared. I should be, but I'm not. It's like, she searched for the words, like there's a greater order to things, like somehow everything is exactly as it should be. I thought of Sophie, sitting next to her deceased grandfather, talking to something we couldn't see, how she showed no fear, only a serene acceptance of the inexplicable. Maybe we could learn something from her. Let's make that coffee, I said softly, and then let's look for that box behind the wardrobe. Claire nodded, a small smile appearing amidst her tears. Yes, let's see what my father wanted us to find. It wasn't a surprise. It was a farewell. The funeral service arrived shortly after. Dr. Evans, a short man with thick glasses and a gray mustache, certified Mr. Abrams' death. Cardiac arrest during sleep, he explained, closing his worn leather briefcase. It was a peaceful death, no suffering. While men in dark suits and rehearsed expressions prepared Mr. Abrams' body, we gathered in the kitchen, me, Claire, Sophie, and Father Michael. The strong coffee bubbled in the Italian coffee maker that Mr. Abram treasured, filling the room with its comforting aroma. Cheese rolls we found in the freezer were now warming in the oven, more out of a need for normalcy than hunger. The memorial mass will be next week, the priest was saying, holding his cup with both hands. We'll say the rosary tonight at the wake. Claire nodded mechanically, as if processing instructions for assembling complex furniture. Sophie, sitting next to me, drew quietly in the little notebook she always carried in her backpack. Every now and then she would look up toward the hallway as if she saw someone pass by. The box, I whispered to Claire when the priest was distracted with Sophie. Behind which wardrobe? It can only be the one in the guest room, she replied. That's where he kept his documents. I waited for the men from the funeral home to finish their work and take Mr. Abrams' body. Father Michael said his goodbyes, promising to meet us later at the wake. As soon as we were alone, we headed to the guest room, which had served as an improvised office for Mr. Abram in recent years. The wardrobe was an imposing piece of rosewood, made by his own hands decades ago when he still worked at the carpentry shop in downtown Crestline. Too heavy to be moved easily. I looked at Claire, who was already kneeling, trying to peer through the gap between the furniture and the wall. There's something there, she confirmed. It looks like a shoebox. With some effort, I managed to slip my arm through the gap and reach the box. It was, indeed, an old shoebox, yellowed with time, tied with a simple string. It had the weight of something holding important secrets. We sat on the bed, the box between us. Sophie joined us, curious. Claire untied the string with trembling fingers and lifted the lid. Inside, there was a manila envelope, some old photographs, a dark wooden rosary, and a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Claire picked up the envelope first, which was addressed to her in Mr. Abrams' neat handwriting. She opened it slowly, as if fearing what it might contain. It's a letter, she said, unfolding 2 sheets of lined paper. And documents. She began to read in silence, her eyes quickly scanning the lines. I saw her face change. Surprise, confusion, then understanding. When she finished, she passed the letter to me without a word. My dearest daughter, the letter began in Mr. Abrams' firm handwriting. If you are reading this, it means I have already gone to join your mother. Do not be sad. I have lived a good and full life, especially after you gave me the joy of watching Sophie grow. I always knew that keeping the farm would be a burden for you after my passing. Despite what I said, I understand your concerns. That is why 2 years ago when Sophie started school, I made a decision that I judged to be the best at the time. I sold half of the property to Mrs. Gable, our neighbor. The money is invested in a fund for Sophie's education. The other half, where the house and the apple orchard are, remains ours. The attached documents explain everything. Mrs. Gable promised never to build or modify her part as long as you want to keep the house. She understands the sentimental value of this place for our family. I didn't tell you before because I feared your reaction. I know how much you care about keeping promises. But sometimes, daughter, we need to adapt our oaths to the realities of life. The land is important, but family is more so. Using this place to secure Sophie's future seemed the best compromise. Take good care of our girl. She has a special gift. She sees things others don't, feels what others don't. Your mother was like that too, though I never fully understood it. Respect that in her. And come whenever you can. The apple trees will bear fruit in September, as always. I'll be there somehow, watching Sophie run among them. With all my love, your father. I returned the letter to Claire, speechless. She was now examining the documents, a deed, contracts, bank statements, everything perfectly organized, as was typical of Mr. Abram. He sold half the land, she murmured, still processing the information. And he didn't tell me. To secure Sophie's future, I completed softly. Claire nodded, a sad smile forming on her lips. He was always like that, pragmatic, solved things his own way. Sophie, who had been quiet all this time, was now fiddling with the small tissue paper package. She carefully unfolded it, revealing an antique brooch, a small blue flower made of some metal that looked like silver, with a stone that sparkled in the center. It was Grandma's, she said with certainty, though she had never seen the object before. She wore it on special Sundays. Claire took the brooch, surprised. How do you know that, Sophie? This belonged to my mother, yes. She passed away when I was 12. You never met her. Sophie shrugged with that childish simplicity. Grandpa told me. He said you should wear it today. Claire held the brooch against her chest, silent tears streaming down her face. They were not tears of despair, but of a deep understanding that I, as an observer, only glimpsed. I think we need to get ready for the wake, she said finally, putting the brooch and documents back in the box. I'm going to take a shower and change. Can you help Sophie get ready? I nodded, realizing she needed a moment alone. While Claire headed to the bathroom, I stayed with Sophie, examining the old photographs that were also in the box. I showed her images of a young Mr. Abram, next to a beautiful woman with dark hair, the grandmother she never knew. She looks like Mommy, Sophie observed, running her little finger over the faded photo. Yes, she does, I agreed. Your mom has her eyes. And I have Grandpa's eyes, she completed with surprising certainty. I looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time on that chaotic day, and she was right. Her eyes were identical to Mr. Abram's, not just in color but in expression, in the way they seemed to see beyond the superficial, as if they carried a wisdom that didn't match her age. Sophie, I asked quietly, how did you know about the brooch? About Mommy's promise? About the box behind the wardrobe? She looked at me, with those ancient eyes in such a young face. I already told you, Dad. Grandpa told me. But how, honey? How can you hear him when... I hesitated, not knowing how to explain death to a 6-year-old. When he's not in his body anymore? She completed, surprising me again. I can't explain it well. It's like when the TV is on mute, but you can still understand what people are saying just by looking. Except it's not with your eyes, it's with something else inside here. She pointed to her own head, then to her chest. I swallowed hard, not knowing what to say. As a father, I wanted to protect her from things I didn't understand, but at the same time I realized that maybe I was the one who needed protection. From the fear of the unknown, from the adult need to rationalize everything. Are you afraid? I finally asked. She shook her head. No, it's just Grandpa. He wouldn't scare me. And is he still here? Right now? Sophie looked around, as if searching for something. No, he went to do something else. But he said he'll be at the wake, and then he'll visit when we come to the farm in the summer. I nodded, deciding to accept her explanation without further questions. Who was I to doubt? On that day, my 6-year-old daughter seemed wiser than I would ever be. Let's get ready for the wake, I said, standing up and holding out my hand to her. Let's say goodbye to Grandpa as he deserves. Claire came out of the shower looking more composed, dressed in simple black. She pinned her mother's brooch to her blouse just as Sophie had suggested. There was a new firmness in her movements, as if the discovery of the letter and the documents had given her a purpose, something concrete to deal with besides the pain of loss. When we were ready to leave, Claire paused at the front door, looking one last time into the house. You know, she said quietly, I think my father knew you were coming today. Somehow he knew he wouldn't be alone when he passed. I thought about my sudden decision to make that surprise visit, the inexplicable impulse that had made me get in the car that specific morning, after 2 weeks of not coming. Coincidence? Or something more? Maybe he asked for one last visit, I suggested, thinking aloud. And somehow we heard. Sophie between us held our hands. He did ask, she confirmed simply. And you heard. Sometimes, silence says it all. Mr. Abram's wake was held at St. Benedict's Chapel, a small stone church in the center of Cresslane that he attended every Sunday. The place was surprisingly full. Neighbors, former colleagues from the carpentry shop, friends from Nelson's bar where he played dominoes on Saturday afternoons, even Mr. Jensen, with whom he had a decades-long feud over a misplaced fence, came to pay his respects. Claire greeted everyone with a serene dignity, her mother's brooch shining discreetly on her black blouse. Sophie stayed by my side most of the time, observing everything with attentive eyes, occasionally whispering comments that made me question once again the limits between what we know and what we only intuit. That lady in the blue dress is Mrs. Gable, she informed me when an elderly woman, but with an upright posture and a lively gaze, entered the chapel, the one who bought half the farm. I watched the woman approach Claire, the two talking in low voices, Claire nodding several times. I couldn't help but notice how Sophie had described Mrs. Gable before even meeting her, the lady in blue. When Father Michael began the final prayers, Sophie leaned toward me. He's happy with how many people came, she whispered. I didn't need to ask who he was. After the ceremony, we followed in a procession to the municipal cemetery, where Mr. Abram would be buried next to his wife, Claire's mother, who had passed away 2 decades earlier. The day was beginning to wane, the late afternoon sun casting a golden light over the tombstones and crosses. There was a melancholic beauty in that moment, the cycle of life completing itself, the sun setting only to rise again the next day. The last words were spoken, flowers were laid, and slowly people began to disperse. We were the last to leave, me, Claire, and Sophie, holding hands before the newly closed grave. Let's go, my love? Claire asked her daughter softly. It's getting late. Sophie shook her head. Just one more minute, I need to tell Grandpa something. Claire looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. I nodded slightly. After everything we had witnessed that day, who were we to doubt? Sophie approached the grave and knelt on the still soft earth. She placed her hand on the mound and closed, her eyes as if in deep concentration. Her lips moved in a whisper we couldn't hear. After a moment, she smiled, nodded, and came back to us. Done, she said simply. We can go now. On the way back to the farm, we decided to spend the night there before returning to the city the next day. Sophie fell asleep in the back seat of the car. Claire looked out the window, lost in thought, her profile silhouetted against the darkening sky, sprinkled with the first stars. What are you thinking about? I asked quietly, not wanting to wake Sophie. Claire sighed. About everything that happened today. About my father's letter. About the things Sophie said. She paused. Do you think she really sees things? Hears things we can't? I thought for a moment before answering, remembering the extraordinary events of that day. I think there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. Shakespeare? She asked, a slight smile on her lips. Hamlet, I confirmed. Your father loved to quote that line. He said people were too quick to dismiss what they didn't understand. Claire nodded, looking out the window again. You know what's strange? I'm not as sad as I thought I would be. There's a sadness, of course, but also a sense of continuity, as if he hasn't really left, just changed form. I understood what she meant. There had been something in the air since we found Mr. Abram that morning. Not the oppressive presence of death, but a sense of transition, of passage. The way Sophie talks to him, I continued, is so natural, as if he were just in another room, not in another plane of existence. Maybe for her, it is like that, Claire reflected. Maybe children don't yet have all these barriers we build as we grow up. We arrived at the farm when night had completely fallen. The starry country sky shone brightly, without the light pollution of the city. We carried a sleeping Sophie inside, and settled her in the room she always used when we visited. After tucking her in, I watched her sleep for a moment. Her relaxed little face looked like that of any normal child, not someone who, hours earlier, was conversing with the invisible and knew things she couldn't possibly know. I went back to the living room, where Claire was examining the documents. Found in the box behind the wardrobe again, I sat next to her on the worn-out sofa that had known so many of that family's stories. Everything is in order, she said, organizing the papers. Dad thought of everything. The part he sold to Mrs. Gable is the one farthest from the house, past the creek. We never really used that area much anyway. And the money for Sophie's education is well invested. Enough for private school until the end of high school at least. And there's still some left over. She smiled, shaking her head. He was always careful with money. Never spent it on himself, but saved every penny thinking about the future. We were silent for a few minutes, just feeling each other's presence, the comfort of being together after 2 weeks apart in such difficult circumstances. I think we can keep the house, Claire said finally. Without the burden of the entire property, the taxes and maintenance are more manageable. We can come on weekends, on holidays. Sophie will love that, I replied. She loves this place. Yes, Claire smiled. And I have a feeling she'll want to come often now, to visit Grandpa. There was no disbelief in her voice, only acceptance. On that day, we had both witnessed things that defied rational explanation, but that somehow made sense on a deeper, more intuitive level. Do you remember, I asked, when Sophie was about 3 and she suddenly started talking about a man in a hat who stood in the corner of her room? Claire nodded. We thought it was just her imagination, a phase. What if it wasn't? What if she's always had this ability, this gift, as Father Michael called it? Claire considered the question for a moment. My mother had it too. You? No? Strong intuitions, dreams that came true. My father always said she knew things before they happened. I thought they were just affectionate expressions, but now you wonder if it's passed from mother to daughter, or from grandfather to granddaughter? She shrugged. Who knows? As you quoted, there are more things in heaven and earth. Our silence was interrupted by a light noise from the hallway. Sophie was standing at the entrance to the living room, rubbing her sleepy eyes. I had a dream, she said. Grandpa was in the apple orchard. He said the fruits will be very sweet this year. Claire opened her arms and Sophie ran into her lap, snuggling as she did when she was even smaller. Was it a nice dream, honey? Sophie nodded against her mother's chest. He was happy, and he wasn't alone. Who was with him? I asked gently. A, beautiful lady, She looked like the lady in the photo, but younger. She was wearing the blue brooch. Claire met my gaze over Sophie's head, her eyes shining with restrained tears. They weren't tears of sadness, I realized, but of a deep understanding of acceptance. "Let's go back to bed, my love," she suggested, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "Tomorrow we need to go back to the city." "Can we come back soon?" Sophie asked. "Grandpa said he'll be waiting." "Yes," Claire promised. "We'll be back soon. This house will always be our special place." As Claire took Sophie back to the room, I was left alone in the living room, feeling the weight and lightness of that extraordinary day. It had started with the intention of a pleasant surprise and ended with a deeper understanding of the mystery that is life, its invisible connections, its unexpected continuities. I stood up and walked to the porch, opening the door to feel the cool night air. The starry sky stretched infinitely above the apple trees that Mr. Abram had planted decades ago. Some were already blooming, small white dots shining in the darkness, promises of sweet fruit for the future. "We'll take good care of them," I said quietly to the night, "and of Sophie too." The wind whispered through the leaves, and for a moment, just a brief moment, I had the strange feeling that I was not alone there. I didn't feel fear, just a deep peace, a certainty that, somehow, everything was exactly as it should be. When Claire returned, she found me still on the porch, looking at the stars. She joined me, sliding her hand into mine. We stood like that for a long time, in silence. There was no need for words. Sometimes, silence says everything that needs to be said. What began as a surprise visit ended as a sacred moment. A moment of connection, of presence, of farewell. And in that silence we found something deeper than words could express. We found peace.